In front of hundreds of witnesses, billionaire Eleanor Blackthorne smiled, dropped the keys to a dead Rolls-Royce at the feet of Owen Rourke, and declared that if the grease-stained mechanic could fix it before dawn, she would allow him to marry her daughter. The crowd laughed, because the car had been silent for 17 years and had already defeated 6 of the finest engineers money could buy. Owen said nothing. He picked up the keys without a word, walked toward the car, and when he pulled back the instrument panel, he found a hidden compartment holding evidence that could destroy the entire Blackthorne empire. Subscribe now, because the secret Owen found inside that car would make the most powerful woman in the room beg for his silence. The Blackthorne estate sat on the southern edge of Charleston's waterfront, like a monument that had never once been asked to justify itself, its white columns and iron gates visible from the harbor road for nearly a mile in either direction. Blackthorne Meridian Holdings was celebrating 50 years of existence that evening, and every name in the city had come to pay tribute. Investors in tailored jackets, senators with practiced smiles, philanthropists whose generosity was entirely conditional. Owen Rourke arrived wearing the only decent suit he owned, a charcoal wool piece that fit well enough, but carried none of the casual authority the other men seemed to wear as naturally as their cufflinks. He came with Vivienne, who walked beside him without apology, her hand resting in the crook of his arm as though the entire marble foyer had always been intended to frame the two of them together. The first person to notice Owen was a woman near the bar who asked him if the valet was still outside, and when Vivienne corrected her with a quiet, deliberate clarity, the woman smiled in that particular way people smile when they are not actually apologizing. Owen said nothing, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, and stood close to Vivienne while the room organized itself around those who belonged and those who were merely tolerated. Grant Wexler found them near the center of the room within 20 minutes, as though he had been watching from somewhere elevated and decided the moment was right. He was a large, well-maintained man in his mid-40s, the kind of person who had grown up being told he was naturally impressive, and he had never found a reason to doubt it. He shook Vivienne's hand first, then turned to Owen with the particular looseness of someone who does not believe the second handshake truly matters. A server carrying a tray of champagne flutes rounded the corner too quickly and jostled against the edge of a nearby table, sending a narrow arc of white wine arching toward Vivienne's dress, and Owen moved without thinking, stepping forward, turning slightly, absorbing the spray across his sleeve, and redirecting the server's tray with one steady hand before a single drop reached her. The room in their immediate vicinity noticed, and Grant watched with an expression that made his contempt look almost like admiration. He looked at the wine spreading across Owen's cuff and said, with practiced lightness, that a man with reflexes like those was probably more useful behind a mop than behind a board table. Vivienne started to respond, but Owen shook his head once, so small it was nearly invisible, and the moment passed. Eleanor Blackthorne crossed the room toward them with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent decades making other people wait. She was 63 and entirely unapologetic about it, her silver hair set against a charcoal gown that cost more than Owen's truck, her posture so exact it suggested the room itself was standing at attention. She greeted Vivienne with a kiss beside the cheek, and then turned to Owen with the kind of look that evaluates rather than sees. She did not offer her hand. Instead, letting her gaze settle on his fingers, the faint lines of motor oil that never fully washed out from the creases of his knuckles, the small callus on his right index finger from years of gripping torque wrenches. She asked him, with the warmth of a tax attorney reading fine print, whether he had remembered to wash his hands before touching her daughter's arm. Vivian's jaw tightened. Owen looked at Eleanor without flinching and said the party smelled like money and not much else, which meant his hands were probably the cleanest thing in the room. Eleanor's smile did not change. Grant laughed as though it was the funniest thing he had heard all evening, which meant he had not found it funny at all. It was Grant who eventually said it plainly, when the four of them were separated from the nearest guests by a gap in conversation. He said Owen's restoration shop had taken a bank loan and missed 2 extension requests, and suggested that a man in that position might see a wealthy girlfriend differently than a man without financial obligations. Vivienne said Grant's name sharply, but Eleanor raised one hand just slightly and the room fell quiet around it. She said she had nothing against ambition, and then added that she had taken the liberty of reviewing Owen's business history, his credit line, and the performance of Rourke Heritage Motors over the preceding 3 fiscal years. She let the word fiscal hang for a moment, as though the technical vocabulary itself was a reminder that she had access to information he had not offered. Owen looked at her steadily and said he was glad someone was paying attention, since he apparently had not been watching closely enough. Eleanor tilted her head, which meant she recognized the deflection and was already planning around it. She said she had something she had been wanting to show her guests, and led the entire gathering toward the back of the estate. The greenhouse sat at the north end of the property, a long glass structure that connected the main house to the garden wing, and in the center of it, beneath a heavy canvas cover, rested the shape of a car that was too large and too intentional to have been parked there by accident. Eleanor stopped beside it, and the assembled guests arranged themselves in a loose arc the way people always arrange themselves when they sense a performance is beginning. She pulled the canvas cover back herself, revealing a 1938 Rolls-Royce Phantom 3 in midnight black, its coach-built bodywork still intact after nearly 90 years, every chrome fitting dulled by time but structurally untouched. It had belonged to her husband Conrad, she said, and she had kept it exactly as he left it because she loved him and could not bear the thought of it running again without him in the driver's seat. She paused. Then she turned to Owen, and in a voice that carried clearly to the back of the room, she said that a man who wanted to enter the Blackthorne family should at least be able to demonstrate that his hands had some value. Eleanor told the assembled guests what the car had cost Conrad to commission, then detailed the 6 specialists she had retained over the years, 2 from England, 1 from Stuttgart, 2 from California, 1 from a private firm in Scottsdale, none of whom had managed to bring it back to running condition. She cited their credentials without looking at Owen, as though the list was simply a matter of historical record rather than a wall she was building around him in real time. Grant added that those engineers had billed collectively at rates that exceeded what most people earned in a decade, and that their failure was not a reflection of their talent. He smiled when he said it. Owen stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the car the way he always looked at machines he did not yet understand, not with excitement but with the patient attention of someone who believes every problem has a mechanism behind it. He noticed something unusual. The dust on the hood was uneven, lighter in the center than at the edges, as though someone had wiped it recently and then let new settling accumulate on top. Eleanor had said no one had touched the car in 17 years. Owen said nothing about what he observed. Eleanor reached into a small silver tray held by her head of household staff and produced the original key to the Phantom 3. She dropped it. Not handed, dropped, releasing it from shoulder height so that it rang against the stone floor once, loud, and came to rest against the toe of Owen's left shoe. The crowd took a small collective breath. She said the terms were simple. If Owen could start the car and drive it from the estate under its own power before 6 in the morning, she would remove her objection to his relationship with her daughter, and she used the word allow in a way that made even the people who agreed with her uncomfortable. She said he would work in the estate's own mechanical facility, with her staff present, and if the car did not move, he would agree to end his relationship with Vivienne, accept no financial settlement, and leave the Blackthorn properties permanently. Vivienne stepped forward and said that she was a grown woman and that her personal life was not a prize to be awarded based on engine repair. Eleanor did not look at her when she responded, only said that every serious proposition required a serious wager, and that Vivienne had always been too sentimental to understand the difference. Owen picked up the key. He held it in his palm for a moment, then looked at Eleanor and said he did not need her permission to love Vivienne and never had, but that he was accepting the challenge because she was using money and social pressure as weapons, and he intended to take both away from her. He said he needed the agreement in writing. Eleanor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and then she smiled in a way that suggested she found the demand charming in its naivete. She agreed quickly, too quickly, and had Grant produce a document that had apparently already been drafted, which meant she had planned this long before she had dropped the key. Owen read it once, then added a handwritten addendum in the margin before signing. If the car operated under its own power before the deadline, Eleanor would be required to answer one question truthfully in front of the company's board of directors at the following morning's annual general meeting. Eleanor did not read it carefully. She signed. Grant offered Owen an estate mechanic's coverall that had been used for cleaning, already stained at the knees. Owen took it in silence. Two guests near the back of the room shook hands over a quiet wager about how long he would last before walking out. Owen was escorted to the estate's private mechanical workshop, a low stone building at the back of the property, where 3 security staff and Grant Wexler would be present for the duration. The Rolls-Royce was towed in on a dolly and set down under fluorescent light. Owen stood back, hands in the coverall pockets, and studied the car from 6 feet away for nearly 4 minutes before touching it. Grant reminded him twice that time was passing. Owen opened the driver's door and looked at the instrument panel, at the clock mounted in the dashboard, which showed exactly 2:17 and had stopped there, its second hand utterly still, except that it was not quite still. Owen leaned close and watched the second hand for a long moment, and found that it trembled once barely, in a rhythm that suggested the movement inside the clock was not dead but merely held. Owen opened the hood and began with the engine. The fuel lines were in exceptional condition for components that were allegedly 17 years untouched, the rubber still pliable, the fittings unoxidized, the connections clean in a way that required periodic attention and not neglect. The oil was dark but not degraded, changed within 6 months at most. The spark plugs were clean and properly gapped. Several bolts showed tool marks that were recent, their edges too bright against the surrounding metal. Owen did not point any of this out. He made his notes in a small spiral pad and moved methodically from one system to the next, and Grant stood near the door and said nothing for almost an hour, only watching. What Owen understood from the first 30 minutes of examination was that the 6 previous engineers had not failed because they lacked skill. They had failed because someone had drawn an invisible boundary around what they were permitted to investigate, and every one of them had respected it. Vivienne arrived at the workshop at 1:30 in the morning, slipping through a side entrance that Grant had not thought to lock. She said she was sorry for what her mother had done and what her mother was. Owen told her there was nothing to apologize for, then said that what he was looking at was not a broken car. He said it was a car that had been paid to stay broken, which was an entirely different problem. She sat on an overturned crate near the workbench and stayed. And when Owen asked her to access the family's archived maintenance records from the digital system she could reach from her phone, she did it without asking why. Grant attempted to bar her from the space on the grounds that the workshop was restricted, and Owen produced the signed agreement, which contained no provision limiting who could accompany him. Grant read the clause twice. He retreated to the corner. Owen found the anomaly behind the firewall, where a wiring harness ran along the inner fender toward the ignition system. One conductor was insulated in period-correct cotton braid, the original 17-year-old wiring of a 1938 automobile, but the cotton itself was clean and even, without the brittleness that came from decades of heat cycling. He followed it to its terminus, a flat palm-sized device bracketed to the rearward face of the engine bay divider. Unremarkable except for the fact that it was not from 1938. It was not even from the decade after that. It was a purpose-built circuit interrupter designed to introduce cascading electrical faults in sequence, cycling through symptoms that would lead a diagnostic technician to replace the distributor, then the condenser, then the coil, before returning to the original fault and starting the cycle again. Owen lifted it into the light and looked at the reverse side, where 2 letters had been engraved by hand in small, careful capitals, EB. Grant said from across the room that initials proved nothing. The tension in his voice proved considerably more. Vivienne had already found the maintenance payment records in the family's financial archive, a series of annual disbursements to a holding company she did not recognize, each logged simply as estate equipment maintenance, each routed through a subsidiary that Grant controlled. Owen removed the interrupter and set it on the workbench. The engine turned over on the next attempt, coughed, caught, idled roughly for 8 seconds, then died. Something was still wrong. He moved to the dashboard. The clock with its frozen hands sat in the center of the instrument panel, and Owen looked at it again, at the 2 hands indicating 2:17, and understood that Conrad Blackthorne had been a man who did not leave things in exactly the position you expected them to be in, unless he intended for someone to notice. 2:17 was not when the car had stopped. It was a date. February 17th was Vivienne's birthday. Owen set the clock's hands in sequence, month, then day, and heard a mechanical click from behind the panel, followed by the soft spring release of a secondary compartment that had been built into the original coachwork and had never appeared on any schematic. The compartment was shallow and lead-lined, long enough to hold a flat box made of burgundy leather embossed with the Blackthorne family crest. Owen looked at it for a moment without touching it, understanding that what he had found was not a piece of automotive history. He lifted it carefully and set it on the workbench, and he looked at Vivienne, who had gone very still on the other side of the room. He said it was hers, not his. He turned away and let her open it. She found a sealed envelope addressed in her father's handwriting, and below it, a folded bundle of documents tied with legal ribbon, a small reel-to-reel tape cartridge, and a brass key no larger than his thumbnail fitted into a slot in the box's interior lining. She read the letter first. Owen kept his back to her for most of it, watching the engine bay, listening to the sound of the paper as she turned each page. When she finally put it down, she was not crying, but her breathing had changed. Conrad Blackthorne had written the letter during the last months of his illness, which meant he had lived with what he knew for years before deciding how to act on it. He had discovered that during a period when he was hospitalized for cardiac treatment, Eleanor had executed a series of documents using a power of attorney that he had never signed, or had signed under conditions he could not later verify because the originals had been replaced. The authentic trust instrument, drafted when Vivienne was born, allocated 28% of voting class shares to her upon her 30th birthday. Those shares represented effective control of Blackthorne Meridian at the board level. The documents in Eleanor's possession showed no such provision. Conrad had asked his personal attorney Lydia Hartwell to investigate, and she had confirmed the discrepancy before being dismissed. He had not gone to the board immediately because he understood what Eleanor would do: liquidate assets, terminate staff, destroy evidence, and then rebuild her defense on the wreckage. He had put everything inside the car because the car was the only place in the world where Eleanor's thoroughness had a boundary. She loved control more than she had ever loved the Phantom 3, but she could not bring herself to open the thing Conrad had loved most, and she had calculated correctly that no one else would be allowed deep enough inside it to find what he had left. Grant moved from his corner toward the workbench. He said the contents of the box were Wart property and had to be surrendered to the family's legal team immediately. Owen closed the lid with one hand. He said the car was held in Conrad's personal trust, not the corporate estate, and that no document in the box carried a corporate registration. Grant stepped forward. Owen looked at him without raising his voice and said the agreement he had signed gave him unrestricted access to every component necessary to restore the vehicle to operation, and that the interior compartment was a component of the original coachwork. Grant understood the argument was sound. He left the workshop. The sound of his footsteps faded quickly down the stone path toward the main house, which meant he was already on his phone. Owen looked at Vivienne and said they needed to move fast and carefully because the people who understood how much this material was worth would not stay calm for long, and calm was the only advantage they currently held. He photographed every document. He transferred the audio from the tape cartridge to Vivienne's phone through an adapter she found in the workshop's spare parts drawer. He placed the originals in the bottom of a mechanical storage case, below a false shelf of gasketing material, and locked it with a padlock from a hook on the wall. He put unrelated restoration paperwork in the leather box and returned it to the instrument panel compartment. Eleanor called him directly at 3:40 in the morning. Her voice was level, precise, and entirely stripped of the performative contempt she had used at the party. She said he had opened something that did not belong to him. She said he should name his price before she decided he was no longer worth purchasing. Owen told her she had misunderstood why he was there. He said he would speak with her in person, and he ended the call. Eleanor arrived at the workshop at 4 in the morning. She came alone, which was the first time Owen had ever seen her without an attendant or a second presence, and the absence made her look less diminished than redistributed, as though she had simply decided that this particular negotiation required a different configuration of herself. She set a folder on the workbench beside the engine stand. Inside was a contract offering $5 million, the termination of his relationship with Vivienne, a permanent non-disclosure agreement, and the full retirement of his workshop's outstanding loan. She said $5 million was more than a man like Owen would accumulate in his entire working life. She said it without cruelty, only with the flat precision of a person who had learned to speak in financial terms because financial terms were always true. Owen asked her whether she had ever intended to give Vivienne what Conrad had left her. Eleanor said the question was irrelevant. Owen said it was the only question that mattered. She said Vivienne had never had the disposition for high-stakes governance. That sentiment was a liability in a company of that scale, and that she had done what any rational steward of a legacy would do when the designated successor was not ready. Owen said she had done what a person does when they believe other people exist to serve their decisions. He said no. Eleanor increased the offer to $10 million and added the mortgage. Owen said no again, and she heard in his voice that the number was genuinely irrelevant to him, which appeared to disturb her more than any counter-argument could have. She changed register. She said she owned the financial instrument that held his workshop's loan, not through the bank directly, but through a private equity vehicle managed by Grant, which meant she had bought his debt months before the party, before the dress rehearsal of the evening, before the dropped key and the crowd that laughed. She gave him until 5 in the morning. If the originals were not handed over by then, the workshop would be seized by noon. Owen looked at the car, then at her, and said he had one observation. Every time she underestimated an opponent, she gave them information she did not intend to share. She had just confirmed that she had been planning this for months. Eleanor smiled without warmth and left. Vivienne, who had been listening from the far end of the workshop, asked Owen why he had not taken the money. He said if he accepted $5 million from Eleanor Blackthorne the night after finding documents that implicated her, every attorney in the state would call it a payoff and the evidence would be worthless. He said they needed someone else to verify the originals before morning. He dialed a number written in Conrad Blackthorne's handwriting at the bottom of the letter. Lydia Hartwell answered on the third ring. She was 68, retired from practice but still current on trust and estates law, and she confirmed immediately that she had been the notarizing attorney on the original instrument. She said the registration numbers on the documents Vivienne photographed matched her notary journal exactly, and the documents in Eleanor's possession carried numbers she had never assigned. She had a copy of the relevant journal pages, and together with the originals, the package was sufficient to file for an emergency injunction preventing Eleanor from exercising voting rights on the disputed shares. She said they would need the originals in hand before the board meeting. Owen looked at the storage case under the workbench and said they would have them. The workshop's exterior security feed dropped signal at 4:51 in the morning. Owen noted the exact time because he had been watching the monitor in the corner of the ceiling. The gap lasted 7 minutes. When it came back, the leather box was missing from the workbench where Owen had not left it, which was exactly where he had intended Grant to look. Grant returned 20 minutes later with the company's in-house legal counsel and 2 members of the security team, and he said Owen had removed confidential corporate documents from a family property, that there were witnesses to the removal, and that the laptop and phone should be surrendered immediately for forensic review. He said it in the practiced tone of someone delivering a speech they had composed in a corridor. Vivienne said nothing. Owen crossed his arms and waited for Grant to finish. Then he asked one question. How did Grant know the box had been on the workbench? Given that Owen had never shown it to him, and Grant had left the workshop before Owen had moved anything from the compartment to the table, the room absorbed this quietly. Grant said the security footage had recorded it before the outage. Owen pointed to the timestamp on the monitor, which confirmed the signal had dropped before anything moved. Grant said the footage was inconclusive and the camera angle was partial. Owen nodded and said he agreed, which was why he had not relied on it. He had recorded the conversation Grant believed was private on the walk from the main house to the workshop, captured on the phone in his breast pocket. Grant's voice confirming to Eleanor that the box had been located and would be in her possession within the hour. He played 12 seconds of it. Grant went very quiet. Vivienne accessed the company's internal transfer records from the dashboard on her phone and found that at 4:47 that morning, 4 minutes before the camera dropped, a instruction had been initiated from the company's contingency reserve fund, directed toward an offshore vehicle registered in a jurisdiction that did not share financial information with domestic regulators. The amount was consistent with the figures listed in Conrad's documents as assets that had been drawn from employee retirement accounts. Grant said it was a quarterly liquidity movement, that he had authorization to execute it, that the characterization was inflammatory and incorrect. Owen said he had no interest in arguing with Grant about it, and that Grant was welcome to explain the timing to the board in 4 hours' time. Grant left. The door closed behind him. Owen reached under the workbench, opened the storage case, and confirmed that the originals were still beneath the gasket shelf, exactly where he had placed them. He went back to the engine. There was still time on the agreement, and a car that had not yet moved under its own power, and Owen Rourke had never walked away from a mechanical problem, because the context around it had grown complicated. He had identified the first interrupter, but the engine was still dying after a few seconds of life, and that meant there was a second interference mechanism. He worked backward through the ignition chain and found it, a vacuum valve that had been modified to collapse the fuel delivery line whenever combustion pressure reached a stable threshold. Elegant, vicious, designed to create the appearance of a successful start followed by irreversible failure. It would stop any engine at the exact moment a diagnostic technician believed the problem was solved. Owen sat on the floor of the workshop and looked at it, and thought about the person who had designed this, and understood that the mechanic who installed it had been given a technical brief that no honest craftsman would have assembled without knowing something was wrong. Vivienne found the name Silas Crow in a payment ledger from 17 years ago, cross-referenced against a one-time maintenance disbursement in the estate accounts. She found a current address, which turned out to be a care facility 12 miles away. She called. Silas was 81 and had the kind of exhausted clarity that comes from carrying something for too long. He confirmed that Eleanor Blackthorne had retained him in the weeks after Conrad's funeral, describing the work as fulfilling her husband's dying wish to preserve the car in static form as a memorial. He had always suspected otherwise. He said there was a second valve, and that it could only be released with the small brass key fitted into the box lining, and that he had kept that detail private because it was the only proof he had that he had not done this willingly. Owen held the key between 2 fingers and said he still had it. Silas said he was glad. Owen thanked him, asked the staff at the facility to let him rest, and then located the valve, inserted the key, and felt the brass turning against 17 years of resistance. It was 5:52 in the morning when Owen turned the ignition key. The engine exhaled once, deeply, and then it caught. Not the rough-edged cough of a sick machine, but the full, composed authority of 250 horsepower, finding its breath again after a silence it had never chosen. The V-12 settled into an idle that filled the workshop with a sound like distant thunder held in a room, even and unhurried, as though the engine had always known it would eventually be allowed to run. Owen sat behind the wheel for a moment and listened to it the way a doctor listens to a chest, and what he heard was a machine that had never needed to be fixed, only unlocked. He put it in gear, rolled it out of the workshop into the pale light of early morning, and drove toward the main house. Eleanor had assembled the remaining guests on the front steps of the estate. She had done it deliberately, ensuring that whoever witnessed Owen's absence from the gates would be standing in the right place to see Vivienne's relationship end publicly and permanently. She stood between Grant and two board members, her posture impeccable, her expression carrying the composed certainty of someone who has already decided how a situation resolves. Grant said, loudly enough for the guests to hear, that the car was still in the workshop and the time had elapsed, and that Vivienne could consider herself freed from a costly mistake. Eleanor said she would have a formal statement prepared by her communications office by 8 o'clock. Vivienne walked down the front steps and stood apart from her mother. She said that Eleanor did not have authority over her life and never had. Eleanor said she would have Vivienne's access to the corporate systems and the family trusts reviewed, and that sentiment was an expensive hobby for someone whose position in the company was still subject to board approval. The sound arrived before the car did, that low, unmistakable authority of a 12-cylinder engine from a century ago, rolling up the gravel approach in the growing light of just before 6. The Rolls-Royce came through the estate gates and moved toward the front steps at a walking pace, and Owen Rourke was behind the wheel in the used estate coverall, unhurried, his hands at the wheel the way they rested naturally at 10 and 2. He brought the car to a stop at 5:59 directly in front of Eleanor. He did not get out immediately. He let the engine idle, and the sound of it was its own answer to every question the evening had raised. The guests who had laughed at him 3 hours earlier were very quiet now. The guests who had placed wagers were looking at different corners of the garden. The head of household staff, who had been asked to inventory the silver after Owen had walked through the dining room, stood at the edge of the steps and looked at the car, and then at Owen, and then very deliberately set the estate's spare key on the front fender rather than returning it to Eleanor's office. Owen stepped out of the car onto the gravel and looked at Eleanor Blackthorne, and he said the car had never been broken. He said it had only been paid to stay quiet. He produced the signed agreement and reminded Eleanor that she had agreed to answer one question truthfully before the board of directors. She looked at the paper. She looked at the car. She looked at the gathered faces of people who had known her for decades and were now watching with the particular attention of those who understand that a balance has shifted. She had no legal avenue of refusal. The board's annual general meeting was scheduled in the estate's conference wing at 8, and the timing of the morning had conspired to deliver everyone necessary into the same building at the same hour. Owen walked inside. He did not wait to be invited. Eleanor attempted to redirect the meeting's opening agenda toward the anniversary presentation, a 20-minute video history of the company that her communications office had prepared for the occasion. She cited procedural requirements and suggested that any additional business be deferred to the written motion process, which required 30 days' notice. Owen waited. When she finished, he said only, "Why did you falsify Conrad Blackthorne's trust instrument and transfer voting shares that belonged to your daughter?" The room did not erupt. It went the other kind of quiet, the kind that happens when a spoken sentence rearranges the structure of a space. Eleanor said Owen was a mechanic who had broken into a private vehicle and fabricated documents to manipulate a vulnerable member of her family, and that she intended to pursue criminal charges. Grant said immediately that the materials had been removed without consent and that the chain of custody was compromised. Owen did not answer either of them. He pressed play on Vivienne's phone. Conrad Blackthorne's voice filled the conference room. Older than the photograph showed, careful in its pacing, the voice of a man speaking slowly because he wanted every word to land exactly where he intended. He spoke to Eleanor directly in the recording about the power of attorney documents, about the hospitalization, about the authorization he had never given for the transfer of voting rights. He asked her 3 times to explain the discrepancy. She answered each time with deflection, and on the 3rd repetition, her voice on the tape said that Vivienne was not ready, that she had never been ready, that someone had to protect the company from people who led with emotion rather than strategy. The room heard Conrad's voice say that he hoped she understood what she had done, and then the recording ended. Eleanor said the tape was taken out of context and was decades old and proved nothing about current governance. Lydia Hartwell walked through the door at that moment, carrying a bound copy of her notary journal, and said she had been waiting outside for 20 minutes at Vivienne's invitation, and that she was prepared to testify about the registration numbers in the room. Lydia confirmed what she had told Owen by phone. The numbers on the documents from the compartment matched her journal exactly, line for line, and the documents in Eleanor's corporate records carried numbers she had never assigned. She said she had been terminated by Eleanor's office within 1 week of raising the discrepancy in writing, and that her termination letter was in the bound file she had brought. Eleanor said Lydia was a disgruntled former employee with no current standing. Lydia said that was entirely accurate, and that it was also irrelevant to the accuracy of her notary journal, which was a legal record and not a personal opinion. An independent board member from the audit committee asked Eleanor directly whether she had executed documents in Conrad's name during his hospitalization. Eleanor said she had managed the company's affairs during a medical crisis as any responsible leader would. The board member said that was not the same as a denial. Another member asked that the morning's vote on executive authority be postponed and Eleanor's voting rights be suspended pending independent review. Vivienne placed a second document package before the board. The transfer records from that morning, Grant's wire instruction, the timestamp, the destination account, the source in the employee contingency fund. Grant said it was a routine treasury movement. Vivienne said the destination was registered to a financial vehicle he controlled personally, which was not a fact he had disclosed in his capacity as CFO. Owen played the recording from the workshop, Grant's voice saying that the box had been located and would be dealt with before sunrise. Grant said the audio was taken out of context. Owen said he was welcome to provide the context that explained why a chief financial officer needed to call the chairwoman at 5 in the morning to tell her that a mechanic's tool case had been moved. The audit committee member called for an immediate suspension of both executives pending review. Eleanor asked the board whether they truly intended to take the word of a person who fixed cars over the woman who had built everything sat in. An older board member, one who had served since Conrad's time, said that the person who fixed cars had found what none of them had thought to look for, and that perhaps that was the more interesting question. Eleanor still held commitments from 4 of the 12 voting members, relationships built over decades, favors extended in both directions, the ordinary architecture of long-maintained power. She told the board that removing her from the chairmanship would destabilize the company, send signals to institutional investors, damage the credit rating on 3 active bond issues, and ultimately cost jobs at every level of the organization. She was right about all of it in the narrow technical sense, and Owen recognized the argument for what it was. Not a defense of her own record, but a human wall constructed from the people who had nothing to do with what she had done. He had read Conrad's letter carefully enough to understand that Conrad had seen this coming too. The letter asked whoever found the documents to protect the employees before exposing the truth, and Owen had thought about that sentence for most of the night. He looked at Vivienne and said quietly that there was a difference between ending Eleanor's authority and ending the company, and that the difference mattered. Vivienne presented a structured transition plan to the board that she had drafted on her phone between 4 and 6 in the morning. In the intervals between searching records and listening to audio playback, she proposed freezing all disputed transactions immediately, restoring the retirement fund to its full balance before any litigation concluded, appointing an independent governance committee to oversee operations during the review period, and separating the board chairmanship from the chief executive function entirely. She said no department would be dissolved, and no staff would be terminated as a result of the transition, and that she was not seeking the chairmanship for herself, but rather proposing an independent interim structure. 3 of Eleanor's 4 committed votes shifted over the next 40 minutes of procedural discussion. The final vote came in at 9 board members in favor of suspension and transition oversight, 3 opposed. Eleanor was removed from the chairmanship by a margin of 1 vote, and her voting rights were frozen pending the audit. Grant's corporate accounts were locked before the meeting ended, and his files were packaged for regulatory review. Eleanor did not speak during the vote count. She sat at the head of the table where she had sat for 23 years, and her face showed nothing except the very slight compression around the eyes that happens when a person understands that the world has changed its configuration, and there is nothing left to negotiate. Vivi was appointed interim chair, with the explicit mandate to relinquish operational control to independent management as soon as the review process allowed, and she immediately named an outside executive director for day-to-day operations, the move that made the remaining skeptics on the board take her seriously. Owen sat in a chair along the wall throughout the proceedings, not at the table, and no one asked him to move. Eleanor found Owen in the estate's library during the recess between the board vote and the formal documentation of the transition. She closed the door. She'd said she wanted him to withhold the retirement fund documentation from the regulatory filing, not permanently, only temporarily, only until she could arrange a private settlement with the affected accounts. She said the scandal would devastate people who were innocent. She said this without her earlier armor, and the absence of it was strange on her. Owen said he understood the distinction between disclosure that protected employees and disclosure that protected Eleanor Blackthorne, and that he intended to give everything to auditors, attorneys, and the appropriate authorities, and that the result would be determined by people trained to make those determinations rather than by either of them. She asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted the workshop loan released, since it had been structured through an entity she controlled as an instrument of coercion. He said he wanted the retirement accounts made whole before the litigation ended, and that he would give his full testimony to whoever needed it. She looked at him for a long time. She asked whether he had ever actually wanted anything that belonged to her family. He said the question told him everything she had never understood about him. Before he left the room, he turned and said, "You spent all evening convinced I wanted to walk into the Blackthorne family. The truth is that your daughter has spent her whole life looking for the door out." The Independent Review concluded within 6 weeks. Lydia's notary journal, Conrad's original documents, and the tape recording together established Vivienne's entitlement to 28% of the voting shares under the authentic trust instrument. She received them formally and placed a portion in a restricted trust tied to the governance reforms she had presented to the board, so that no single person could exercise the kind of unchecked control her mother had maintained. She sold a block of personal assets to restore the retirement fund shortfall before any settlement required it, and the affected employees received their full balances. Owen was notified that the workshop loan had been released from its controlling instrument and transferred to a standard commercial structure. Grant Wexler was indicted on 4 counts of securities fraud and 3 counts of financial record manipulation. He entered a cooperation agreement with the prosecution in exchange for testimony about Eleanor's instructions, which did not reduce his exposure as much as his attorneys had expected. Eleanor entered a civil settlement negotiation that involved relinquishing her remaining Blackthorne Meridian holdings and contributing proceeds from personal real estate sales toward regulatory penalties. The criminal referral remained under review. Owen was asked twice by the company's new leadership whether he wanted a role as a technical director or an executive advisor. He declined both times, and on the third mention said he would welcome a contract to complete the restoration of the Rolls-Royce Phantom III at his standard commercial rate. They agreed. The Rolls-Royce was finished 2 months later in the workshop of Rourke Heritage Motors, which had settled into the unremarkable business of being solvent and open during regular hours. Vivienne visited one evening when the car was nearly done and asked Owen whether he was disappointed that his life had not changed more dramatically. He said the dramatic change was not the point, and that his life already belonged to him, which was the only transformation he had ever needed. She said she had spent years inside a structure that defined her entirely by the family name on her office door, and that the strangest part of the preceding months was realizing she had never once been asked what she actually believed about anything. Owen said that was something a person could fix without needing anyone's authorization. Vivienne stood beside the Phantom III and looked at the secret compartment behind the clock which Owen had refinished but left operable. She reached in and found the ring he had placed there, not dramatically, not with a speech, only set inside the space that had once held the thing that needed to be found. He said he was not referencing any promise Eleanor had made. He was asking whether she wanted to build something that no family name and no board vote could undo. She said yes, without ceremony, as though it were simply the most accurate answer available. Mason called that evening to congratulate his father, and the call lasted 3 minutes, exactly the right length for a 19-year-old with an engineering exam the following morning. The company stabilized. The charitable foundation Vivienne restructured was renamed without reference to Eleanor, and its new technical training program offered pathways for working tradespeople to advance their qualifications without stopping work. Owen helped design the curriculum and declined a stipend. The wedding was held at Rourke Heritage Motors on a Saturday in October, with 31 guests, co-workers, old friends, 3 long-serving Blackthorn Meridian employees who had asked if they could come, and Mason, who stood beside his father in a suit that fit considerably better than Owen's had the night the story began. The Rolls-Royce Phantom 3 was parked outside the shop's bay doors, freshly restored, its black coachwork catching the afternoon light without asking permission. Per the terms Conrad had specified in his letter, Vivian transferred ownership to the State Automotive Heritage Museum the following week, on the condition that it be driven on public roads at least once annually, so that whatever it had been made to be, a memorial, a vault, a message waiting 17 years for the right person to find it would finally be allowed to simply move. Eleanor sent no delegation and no flowers. She sent an envelope addressed to Owen, inside which was a single card that read, "You were right. I misjudged you." Owen put it in the drawer of his desk without response, not because it meant nothing, but because the answer had already been given. In the shop, in the boardroom, in the choice he had made at every point in the night when accepting Eleanor's terms, would have been the simpler thing to do. Before the car left the property for the last time, Owen walked to the driver's door and looked through the window at the clock still mounted in the instrument panel, set now to the actual time, running, its hands moving in the ordinary direction that clocks are supposed to move. He had reset it himself, and it kept perfect time. Eleanor had once believed that the Rolls-Royce was the instrument she would use to prove that Owen Rourke was not worthy of the Blackthorn name. What the car had actually proven in the end was that Eleanor herself was no longer worthy of deciding that question for anyone.